Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the New York State Water Resources Institute, the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association, and the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, welcome to today's webinar, an introduction to FEMA National Flood Insurance Program Community Rating Systems, a New York State perspective. The New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association brings together New York State professionals to foster awareness, information exchange, and cooperation in the floodplain and stormwater management fields. Add your voice and join today. Membership is inexpensive and a great way to stay informed about future trainings and regulatory changes. Relevant to today's webinar, the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association has a community rating system users group to help communities improve CRS ratings and encourage new communities to participate. Our presenter today, John Gauthier, is the co-chair of the CRS users group. Ask him a question during the webinar. The New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association is excited to announce the NewYorkFloods.org has gotten a serious facelift. The new website has a new look, new features, and new content. With help from flood management experts across the state, we have gathered highly relevant training resources and have improved ways for you to connect with other flood professionals, including the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association board members and state technical experts. We definitely encourage you to check it out. The New York State Water Resources Institute supports robust science and dialogue between researchers, managers, policymakers, and the general public to improve water management. The Water Resources Institute seeks to better understand how individuals and communities perceive flood risk and define resilience, with the goal of improving extension and outreach to achieve flooding mitigation and adaptation. Learn more about our work on flooding at our website. And for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center, our team enhances the managerial and financial capacity of regional and local governments, nonprofit organizations, and local residents to improve environmental infrastructure, services, and quality of life. Our partnership with our co-hosts for this webinar series is supported under a grant by the Rural Utilities Service, housed in the United States Department of Agriculture. And so for the webinar today, everyone that has joined us will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. We will be holding all questions for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will also be posting a video recording on the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center's website. You will be receiving a follow-up email that includes a link to all of these materials. You will also see a list of documents located in the handouts section on your GoToWebinar control panel. These are available for you to reference. Our facilitator, Kristen Hitchcock, will touch upon these documents again later in the presentation. If you have any issues accessing these documents, please notify us in the questions dialog box. And for registered attendees who meet criteria shown on the slide, you will receive a certificate of attendance for participating in the webinar today. This webinar has not been submitted to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits or training credits. Certificates will be emailed in the next week. Questions about certificates can be directed to Seth Lisbon at the email provided at the bottom of the slide. And so on that note, to jump right in, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today's webinar. With us this morning, we have John Gauthier, professional engineer, associate engineer for the town of Greece, certified floodplain manager, and New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association board member. And I just want to remind folks, that after John's presentation, we will have more information and a panel discussion, so please stay with us for the full program. So John, welcome, and I pass everything over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thanks for being with us this morning. I'm going to begin with the usual disclaimer of the views that I'm presenting on The floodplain program and CRS are mine and not the town of Greece's or any other organization. I think they're the truth. It's what I've come to believe. Okay, an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the flood insurance program as well as the CRS program. And my focus on CRS is improving flood resiliency. There's a lot of push for other purposes, but I think improving flood resiliency is the most important aspect of it. The National Flood Insurance Program, it's intended to provide insurance against catastrophic losses. There are private policies and currently some remaining subsidies. The cost of a policy is, in theory, based generally on the risk of flood damage, like any other flood insurance policy. Risk is a function of the location and the elevation of the building with respect to the base flood elevation and the structure type. The program is nominally a voluntary program, but if a community does not stay in good standings in the program or participate at all, there are some harsh consequences that can be of significance. These are pros and cons of the flood insurance program from a floodplain manager's perspective. On the positive side, and this is referring to the standard default program without being in the CRS. It provides a mechanism for sharing flood risk across the nation. It's an established program, and it provides economic stability for property owners and for local governments. The downside, it provides it enables in some ways a level of risk taking that people would not take in some instances if they were personally responsible. And it generally, again, in the base program without any CRS involvement or any special conditions, it allows the filling of the floodway buffer. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And it's entirely based, or mostly based, on aging data and, in some cases, outdated analysis. And it puts a lot of weight on that data. Some recent milestones that are of significance. The Biggert waters got a lot of attention in 2012, and it followed Rita, Sandy, Irene, and a whole sequence of catastrophic storm events that were thought to be in excess of 100-year events. And there was a push for eliminating the subsidized flood insurance rates for non-actuarial based properties. In reaction to that, there was another act in 14 that kind of eased the impacts of those. And that is a kind of an inevitable back and forth between the position of subsidizing these to continue all the benefits of the program and then having to pay for it, as we have experienced some incredibly large events that couldn't have been anticipated. In February of 1980, the town got some really bad news, and we were found to be out of compliance with the flood insurance program. And being in suspension from the program was viewed as incredibly bad news. So I was not with the town at that time. I didn't join for another 20 years, but I understand what occurred. It served as a wake-up call. We got some individuals trained, and we were fortunate enough to, at that time, employ some people that took a real leadership program. And eventually it resulted in us entering the CRS program. And we did it not to save on insurance policies, but to just give a little bit of freeboard, more or less, between the bare minimums of the program, so that if we, fell back a little bit, we could still become, part of the program. All right, with that introduction, I'm going to get a little bit into the CRS program itself. The goals, and this is from a big picture perspective, it's to reduce flood damage, strengthen and support the insurance aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program, and to encourage communities to take on a comprehensive approach to floodplain management. And the image on the right side is a false color infrared of the town of Greece. And you can see we've got Lake Ontario all along our shoreline. And that's where most of our policies are. The benefits of the program are to reduce insurance policy rates. And that's, I think in the case of most municipalities, the greatest motivation for entering the program, and the savings can be substantial. Also, improved flood protection, enhanced flood insurance policy, enhanced public safety, improved resiliency, and then there's this incentive to continue in the program. Just as policyholders get notified of increased discounts when the program is going well, they also get a letter if the program falls back, saying that there was a failure to maintain program commitments. So that gives the community a lot of incentive for the community leaders to continue along the straight and narrow. And sometimes that involves making some hard choices. The community's responsibilities in the program are to designate a coordinator, to coordinate with the ISO specialist, and the ISO represents the insurance industry. They will come and do regular checks how you're doing, and they also have 5-year cycles where they do a more in-depth audit. Then you can go forward and implement the program to the extent you want to. As I mentioned, there's annual recertification and providing documentation. And you have to let both FEMA and the insurance industry know if there's a program change, and you have to maintain records. This is an example of what we had going on, and what on the left is a prior town law we had, and a town is required to have a compliant local statute that meets the minimum requirements. And we did just that from the 1990s until we changed it in 2018. And this is, as I mentioned before, it allows the filling of the floodway fringe. And that is the portion of the floodplain outside the floodway. It's relatively a lenient standard under the minimal standards. We have recently updated and are currently in effect. There's a law that prohibits net filling of the floodplain, prohibits new buildings in the floodplain. It requires 2 feet of freeboard, and we go beyond the FEMA floodplain and actually use some prior studies and other relevant flood data to regulate the floodplain. Okay, now this is a multi-part slide, and it shows this is the floodplain. If you could look at a cross section of the stream, this is the floodplain, and then to compute the floodway, you create an artificial dam in the software until the stream rises a foot. The part that's remaining outside the main channel is called the floodway fringe, and that in your standard DEC model is permissible under FEMA. This is the floodway, and that's the portion that carries the majority of the flow. And the surcharge is a foot that you would model to determine the floodway. And you can't do any filling of the floodway under even the most lenient standards that wouldn't meet the FEMA requirements. Okay, let me jump further into CRS. If you're thinking about joining, the obvious questions are, do you have a number of people? Are you relatively compliant? And is there adequate support from the administration to take on the additional program requirements? I'd further recommend that if you are not currently compliant, I would wait to join until you are compliant. It doesn't make any sense waving a red flag to the agencies that you're non-compliant. It's also very helpful if your community has GIS capabilities, because many of the CRS activities look for spatial representations of impact of what's going on in various percentages of the community, and doing it without GIS would be very challenging. A community would enter the program as a class 10, and for every 500 points that are accumulated, you'd advance from a 10 to a 9 and so forth. And as you do that, for properties inside the special flood hazard area, you gain another 5 points. So you have to determine how many points are worth gaining and how much you want to advance. Greece stayed at the level 8 for about 15 years. Then we discovered we could advance without any undue burden, and we did so, and we're currently, sitting at a class 6. The push is largely based on the kind of results that are perceived by the administration and how much challenge it is chasing down additional points and defending them in a manner that you don't have a risk of falling back. And you'll notice for outside the special flood hazard area, there's a lesser discount, but that's the price is already greatly discounted if you're outside the special flood hazard area. This is a list of activities that are available. It's kind of a menu you can pick from. And the only one that's absolutely required is elevation certificates. That is a world unto itself. It's highly specialized, it's very technical, but it describes how a given property is situated with respect to the floodplain and the kind of risk that's involved. So the whole flood insurance program is based on this, and CRS communities are scrutinized very carefully, and it's dependent on cooperation generally in the building department. The people that give out the building permits are the people that have to be on board for that. If they're not on board, it's just not going to work. So once you get past that, there's other specialty areas. And the things that a community can take on are largely dependent upon you know, how the community is situated, the geography, how it's developed, and many of the activities are very challenging and have few points, and some are not particularly challenging and have a lot of points. And you have to tailor your approach, you know, for what works for your community. But there's this matrix, and then there's another more detailed breakdown within this. For us, the open space item 420 has been very beneficial, and it was very easy. We have almost 40% of our town's floodplain is in publicly owned land that has been reserved as a wildlife area. And that accounts for approximately 1,000 points, which is 2 classes. The other area where we've gotten a lot of points is the higher standards. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. This is the breakdown for area 430. And it, for the most part, reflected things we were already doing but just hadn't documented. In development limitations and freeboard, the new code section I showed at the beginning took care of a great deal of that. And it was, they were just points sitting there that we could have, and it reflected what we were already doing. We just had to basically dot our I's and cross our T's, which entailed changing our code to reflect what we were already doing. But for each community, there are things like this available if you have reasonable practices out there. At the bottom, there's staff training. At Emmitsburg, FEMA runs the training classes that are qualified, and you can gain points by having your staff members do that, as well as getting CFM certification, which the FEMA school at Emmitsburg is helpful for, and also the New York State Floodplain Managers Association has programs to help people get certified in that. But there's the highlighted items are all items that we are currently working on that work for us. This is the most current list of the non-class 10 CRS communities in New York State. And almost everybody is an 8 or a 9. And what's kind of strange is if you look at other states, their typical numbers are much lower. They're much more advanced, largely because they do a lot of things on a regional and statewide basis to a greater extent than New York State does. There are incredible success stories. I saw the city of Batavia. They entered as a class 7, which is pretty remarkable, seeing, you know, we spent here in Greece, we spent 15 years at a class 8. They just walked in the door at 7 through a lot of hard work, but they had motivation. They were finding their municipality was being very adversely impacted by the high cost of flood insurance, and it was leading to people abandoning their homes. But this could make a difference, they found, and it really helped. You know, many examples I have heard of our residents paying as much as $1,000 a month. So if you can save them 25% of $1,000 a month, it becomes appreciable. But certainly would like to see more communities in New York State join the program and do better. I think it would be a benefit to all of us if we work together on that. Some resources that are available for all of us to use. A lot of my slides came from the crsresources.org. It's a very valuable source of information. The CRS manuals on that, and a lot of current information about the program. And New York Floods is the Floodplain Managers Association website, and we're working very hard to put improved products out there for training. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, John, for providing your expertise. At this point, you know, for any attendees on the call that has specific questions for John, please submit them. As of right now, we have not received questions, so I'm just going to move on and introduce our next speaker and panel discussion. So our next presentation is Dr. Kristen Hitchcock, Research and Outreach Specialist at the New York State Water Resources Institute, for a short presentation on CRS resources. Kristen will address pros and cons of the CRS program as well, and then Kristen will facilitate our panel discussion today, right after her presentation. So Kristen, I welcome you and pass everything over to you.
All right, great. Are you seeing my screen right now? Great, okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, John. That was an excellent talk, as usual. My talk will hopefully, some of what I say will be a little repetitive of what John said, but hopefully it will take, bring his messages home. So basically my talk, I'm hoping to be a bridge between John's talk and the panel a bit. Again, primarily what I'm talking about is a summary of some pros and cons of CRS participation, particularly in New York State. Focus in on some of the resources for training and technical assistance that are available, and then I'll introduce the panel. So to get started, basically, John highlighted this nicely. Participation in the program is fairly low in New York State. So there's about 1,500 NFIP communities, and only 35 are in the program at class 9 or higher, as he showed. So based on some interviews with 22 of the CRS communities, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but basically their take-home message was that the program is complicated but worth it. So what they found was that every community interviewed listed challenges in the applications and the maintenance of status in the CRS program. But then also every municipality except for one would recommend the CRS program to other communities and thought that enrolling in the program was worth the effort. So trying to give a balanced view of the CRS program, but that keep that in mind as you listen to what I have to say. So again, what I'm going to talk about, the pros and cons pieces are really synthesized from 3 sources. The New York State Floodplain Stormwater Managers Association, FEMA, they have a CRS users group, and they put together a set of recommendations for the CRS task force from in 2016. There was also what was then called the Hudson Estuary Watershed Resilience Project, particularly Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County. That has now changed names, and it's the Hudson River Flood Resilience Network that maybe Nathan will talk about a little bit later. But anyway, they put together a white paper on the FEMA CRS cost benefit analysis for New York State communities. And what they did was they interviewed 22 municipalities, or at least representatives from those municipalities enrolled in the CRS program, to help determine the challenges and opportunities that municipalities face in enrolling CRS and maintaining certification. I also got some input from Janet Thigpen. She's a CFM, a floodplain mitigation specialist, Southern Tier Central Regional Planning Development Board, and has been involved in a disproportionate number of the CRS certifications in this state. So I'll say I got all that input, but any errors or omissions in what I have to say are my fault alone. So, but I am pulling on this knowledge of other people for what I have to say. So basically the pros, and I won't spend a ton of time on the pros. Again, some of this will echo what John said, but the overall objectives of the program are very positive. So to reduce flood damage, increase flood insurance coverage, and foster comprehensive floodplain management to address and mitigate flooding vulnerabilities. And FEMA goes on to say they're hoping to keep their citizens safer, minimize property damage, build resiliency, and foster better quality of life within the community. So all positive things, obviously. Again, John talked about the cost savings. So cost savings, there are direct cost savings that he talked about in terms of discounted flood insurance premium rates. There's also indirect benefits from a reduction in long-term damages caused by flooding. There also is some value in demonstrating to the citizens that the government is doing something and to help with flood resilience, and it allows municipal governments to provide relief to property owners. So some of the other benefits, again, is this overall improved flood risk management. So generally speaking, the participants thought that activities credited by the CRS program provide excellent guidance for local efforts. That there is a general focus on being proactive instead of reactive, which not only saves money but also save resources and can save lives. It also looks beyond the active flood zone in planning and mitigation. And then there's also some thought that once a community is in, there's some momentum to stay in the program, though that is not, it's not true across the board. That they may be more likely to consider implementing or documenting additional activities to improve the rating and reduce flood damages, and to promote continued documentation and record keeping, including maintaining accurate elevation certificates. So they have a motivation, a reason, sometimes even a timeline to stay on top of those kinds of things. And encourages awareness of the floodplain management activities, and an influence for communities to increase implementation of those adaptation and mitigation activities. So generally, there is a lot of positive there. So I will spend a little time on some of the cons. One of the big ones is that many people said that the program is too complicated and confusing to implement. So basically the paperwork and documentation is onerous. Scoring points by activity are were thought to be inconsistent and not transparent, so they don't necessarily, communities don't necessarily receive a detailed description of what they received points for. The CRS manual can be confusing. Again, I want to say it's 641-page document. It requires detailed understanding of credit criteria, including activity prerequisites and acronyms. There's a 4-day FEMA training to get into that, but that may be a lot for a small community to deal with. And you may need to hire a consultant to assist with development and implementation of the CRS program. That may not be a con, and I think Nathan will talk about that a bit, but you know, it may be a barrier to some communities. In general, New York State communities, many are small with very limited capacity. About 75% of New York State municipalities have less than 5,000 residents. Basically often have part-time staff and volunteer boards, which doesn't mean work can't get done. It means you need an enthusiastic champion often to make things happen. Again, as John talked about, they may lack the technical capacity, for example, GIS to do impact adjustment maps. Often in these small communities, there may be few buildings located in these special flood hazard areas, so the mapped floodplains. Few NFI, that may mean few NFIP flood insurance policies, and it might be hard to justify the expenditure. This may be a little bit old. I think this number is from 2016, but about 11% of New York State municipalities have more than 100 flood NFIP policies. So it's not a lot that have a lot of policies. So a couple general, there's also New York State home rule. So there isn't county level land use authority, and also counties can't participate in CRS in New York State, though many of the actions occur at the county level. Again, it doesn't make it impossible at all to participate in CRS, but it may be one of the barriers. A few general, or that also in these municipalities, many New York State municipalities only have approximate floodplain studies, so that they don't have base flood elevation needed to qualify for a number of the actions for freeboard and other credits. So in general, non-CRS flood insurance policies will cost more, and basically they subsidize the CRS discounts in our state, but also in other places, in states like Florida, where there's a really high CRS participation. Maybe that's incentive, maybe that's not a con, maybe that's a pro, that's an incentive to participate in this program. There's an emphasis on protecting open spaces, but not necessarily tailored to rural communities that have privately owned, undeveloped, or farm floodplains, and often have no zoning. Not necessarily, but in many cases that is true. And often not a lot of credits for activities outside of the special flood hazard areas. So again, just to not end on a total negative, again, this is the you know, hopefully a broad picture of pros and cons. Again, those municipalities that were interviewed that are participating said there were a lot of cons, but it was still something they would recommend to other communities. So hopefully we'll dive into this more in the panel discussion. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about resources that would be available to you or to your communities. We have a few of them available as handouts in the webinar right now. We will be sharing more after the webinar, so we'll have PDFs of all these talks. including a link. So I'll have a links page to everything that I mention here. So, you know, feel free to jot things down, but also know that this will be coming to you with links shortly. So several places to go for technical assistance. Again, the FEMA regional offices can help you and particularly give you specifics on the policies. They also have, as John mentioned, the Emergency Management Institute. And one of the things they have at EMI is a 4-day in-person CRS course. Again, you know, that may be beyond the capacity of your community to send somebody there, but it's an excellent resource. Other sources of technical assistance, so this like actual assistance directly to communities, is through the New York State DEC's floodplain management section. So they have the central office floodplain management coordinators, the Western New York Flood Hub, and the regional floodplain management coordinators, and this is all outlined on their website. Also, as John mentioned, and as I referred to, there is the New York State CRS Users Group, which is part of NYFISMA. NYFISMA, I think I may be saying that wrong, NYFISMA. That they meet as part of the annual meetings. The next group, the regional planning agencies, they can provide you with a lot of assistance. It depends a bit on your particular agency, but again, Janet Thigpen is an excellent resource. So some of the planning agencies can, if nothing else, can point you to good resources. And Cornell Cooperative Extensions, the ones that I know of, particularly in the Hudson, and they can also give you some assistance. So actual some resources that might be helpful to you, some documents that might be helpful to you. So again, an overview. There's FEMA has a number, and then there are a few others. So from FEMA, there's an overview fact sheet. It's just a 2-pager, but it might be helpful. You know, it gives an overview of the program and the points, and it might be something you might want to share with boards. They also have a document that they put out. It's a 6-pager, and it talks about small communities in the CRS. Again, I think obviously a lot of New York State communities are small, and I think a lot of you in attendance are from small communities. There's also there's a CRS application letter and quick check tool. So basically, the letter is just a form letter, but you can tailor it to you, and that's what you have to submit to be part of the program. The quick check tool is a tool for documenting current activities and for calculating possible credit points. I think based on the interviews and some feedback, may not be really a quick check. Some people say that it is fairly onerous to go through that tool, but helpful in the end. There also is a CRS self-assessment tool. It's also to help understand basically the risks and benefits inherent in floodplains, which CRS activities may most benefit your community. And the idea behind that is it hopefully wouldn't take a day. Not that you all have a day sitting around, but you know, some say it only takes a couple hours to get through that assessment. Again, as John mentioned, there's the coordinator's manual, which has lots of information, is a bit dense, but you know, on the flip side, there's a lot there, 641 pages. Recently, it's not directly related to CRS, but will actually probably be helpful in going for many of the activities covered under CRS, are a series of guides to expanding mitigation. These were put out specifically by our region, FEMA Region 2, and they include things like focusing on equity, electric power, municipal financing, transportation, public health, agriculture, arts and culture. So a lot of great effort into those resources, and they're good, and they're regionally relevant. And finally, the crsresources.org is, John mentioned too, it's a great place. It's organized by the types of activities, and you can find many of these. Definitely the quick check tool and the self-assessment, but then it goes into much more detail with information about specific activities. So beyond FEMA, some other resources that might be useful. Again, the national level, we've been talking about NICE FSMA, but the national level Association of State Floodplain Managers has a great CRS resources page. As John mentioned, NICE FSMA has a CRS training page. You may want to check it out. Recently, this was fairly recently developed, and there are now, NICE FSMA has many training pages that you may be interested in exploring. But the CRS training page follows the structure of many of the pages, and they have sort of quick bites, quick things to get an idea about the program, and then some deeper dives that go into more detail about the program as well. And then they have their own list of resources there as well. And then finally, New York State Water Resources Institute, so where I'm coming from, has a flood resilience crosswalk specifically for New York State communities that basically identifies key actions that promote flood resilience for New York State communities, while giving you points in both the CRS and the state's Climate Smart Communities program. And I just will very quickly mention that the state of Vermont has an excellent program around floodplain education and training, and they do have CRS resources, but it's called Making Room for Rivers, Vermont Rivers program. So that's what I have, and thank you for your time here. I am going to give control back to the coordinator here.
I'm doing that right now, Kristen.
Okay, did I? Great. All right. So, again, yeah, I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with these three panelists. You've heard from John. I'll quickly tell you, John is the acting town engineer and CRS coordinator for the town of Greece. He's been employed by the town of Greece for the past 20 years. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Detroit, a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering from Wayne State University, and a Juris Doctor degree from Michigan State. Russell Houck is a professional engineer in New York with a focus on civil engineering and water resources. He's also a certified floodplain manager and has been since 2003. He's currently with the City of Syracuse Engineering Department, has been there for 10 years, working on roads, sewers, and trail projects, and assists in floodplain management for Syracuse and the review and development within the floodplain. And then we also have Nathan Mitchell, who grew up in Piermont and currently serves as the chair of the Waterfront Resiliency Commission, as a trustee on the village board, and as a member and past dive lieutenant of the all-volunteer fire department. He works in IT industry as a database developer and a disaster recovery systems integrator. So we're really fortunate to have this wonderful panel with not only such broad experiences, but also kind of bringing unique perspectives. So really happy to have you all here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think we're going to start by just giving everybody, each of the panelists, 5 minutes to introduce yourselves. And I think I'll start with you, Russell, if you would.
Sure. I'm Russell Houck, again, with the City of Syracuse Engineering Department. And I've been there 10 years and pretty much more of a transportation engineer, also involved in water resources. get involved in trail projects. But probably about 10% of my time gets applied to floodplain management. Most recently in Syracuse, our county and the city was remapped. We now have the new floodplain maps, flood insurance rate maps. That brought a lot more attention to the floodplains within Syracuse, including protests and even some congressional action about the floodplains there. We are a CRS community rated 7. We went from an 8 to a 7 on the last round in 2016, I think it was, and the state's undergoing the recertification process right now as well. I think for communities looking to get into the CRS, it does, everyone said it here so far, it does take a good amount of dedicated time. I said I'm at about 10% for floodplain management. I think to truly do it justice, it would take about 25% of someone's time at least. I'm finding, kind of a bit short on the outreach side. If I had more time, we would do a lot more outreach. We're also at the point of kind of what's the next step in floodplain management. We review commercial development, residential development within the floodplain, but how do we reduce the risk actually and the flood extents within the floodplain? That's where we are now. We're looking at some pre-disaster mitigation grants through FEMA, where we can actually start to address flood risk. So that's really where we are right now, and certainly open to any questions regarding floodplain management and the CRS.
Fantastic. All right, Nathan, would you like to go next?
Sure. So my name is Nathan Mitchell. I'm from the Village of Piermont, and our story with CRS basically goes back to Superstorm Sandy. So back in 2012, Superstorm Sandy came through and had a really devastating impact on Piermont. Just so you know a little bit about the geography, we're called Piermont because the main focus of the town is a pier that was built out into the channel of the river back in the 1800s as the original terminus for the Erie Railroad. So the pier is about a mile long and gets you all the way out to the deep water channel where barges could get loaded and take freight down into the city. The other part of Piermont is Mont, and that is the mountain that we sit at the base of. So the majority of our downtown is a couple 100-year-old landfill, essentially. And we have a lot of low elevation properties that have been developed for hundreds of years. We also have the Piermont Marsh, which is part of the Hudson River National Estuarine Reserve, which is directly to our south, although it is not within the Village of Piermont. And the Sparkill Creek runs through the Piermont Marsh. So we have a creek running down the middle of town and the river alongside part of town and a steep hillside behind town. So we actually, on the flooding map, show up in all of the categories. We have hillside flooding issues in hurricanes like Irene that came through in the past. We have storm surge flooding issues in hurricane events like Sandy that have happened more recently. So essentially, it was a big wake-up call for us, and we decided that we needed to look at what all our options were, what ways we could improve our resilience. And in 2013, we formed a waterfront resilience task force that in 2014 came up with a resilience roadmap, which was a series of recommendations of things that the village at a municipal level and on a community level should endeavor to do to improve our resilience moving forward. One of those was the establishment of a permanent Waterfront Resilience Commission, which was commissioned in 2015, and that I serve as the chair of right now. It's all volunteer, but we do work closely with our building department and engineering staff on a number of the funding applications and projects like CRS that we try to get into. Our joining the CRS program was another one of our resilience roadmap suggestions from 2014, along with participation in the Climate Smart Communities and Clean Energy Communities programs from the state. I also had a recommendation that we should update our building and zoning code to include a flood damage prevention section, which we did, and we adopted the state's boilerplate and then added an additional foot of freeboard on top of the standard 2 foot of freeboard, and put that in place in all of the areas within the ABFE, as well as adopted what at that point in 2015 was still a draft, but the updated FEMA flood maps. So we did a lot of the right things, and we felt like we were in a pretty good place going into the CRS program. We managed with almost entirely volunteer staff hours to get certified bronze in Climate Smart Communities program, and also get certified as a clean energy community without it really costing us a lot of money or particular need for dedicated staff. We hit a brick wall with CRS. We went as far as we had our community visit going back in 2016. And I learned in 2018 that those things actually expire if you don't follow up with the subsequent steps. So we were forced to go back to step 1 in 2018, which we did. And we have made a bit of progress since then. But I think the most important takeaway that I can share for communities like Piermont, which has got a population of about 2,500, is that you shouldn't intend to get enrolled in the community rating system without dedicating budget and funding to staff. So where we're at right now in 2020 is I was able to secure the funding from the village board in this current year for us to hire a consulting company to finish up the last couple of steps that are required for us to get certified in the CRS program. And I'm excited about it, and we did a cost-benefit analysis on it, and what we came up with, and this is going to be different for every community, but what we came up with was for the number of policyholders we have within the district, which is less than 50 out of about 1,500 homes in the community. The amount of money that the village is spending to get the consultant to do this last portion of the approval process is going to be repaid and then plus some in terms of direct savings to residents within the next 5 years. So it sounded like the math worked and we were able to move forward with it. And I would strongly suggest to anyone who is interested in getting their small community to be able to participate in this program that you start with that cost benefit analysis. And if you can demonstrate the amount of savings that are going to be available to residents, you can make the argument that those savings, among other things, support real estate values. Because one of the factors that people are now looking at when they look to buy a home in Piermont is it in the flood zone, and what is my flood insurance going to cost, and how much is that going to go up in the next 20, 30 years that I have this mortgage. So that's essentially the way we were able to get to where we're at now, but we basically wasted 5 years pretending that a group of volunteers could just do this in their spare time. And there's just way too much follow-up, and there's way too much that needs to be kept on top of in terms of paperwork. For example, I spent an afternoon with a group of 6 people from PWRC manually going through our building department files for all of the properties that were within the flood zone to try to determine if we did in fact have elevation certificates on file. And although we amended our code in 2014 with the flood damage prevention code to require elevation certificates for any construction project requiring a permit in the flood zone, we really don't have very many of them yet. And another thing that I would mention that isn't specifically tied to CRS, but is a lesson that we learned that previously one of John's slides had kind of touched on was about substantial improvements. So our flood damage prevention code says that any new construction or substantial improvement in this area must be brought up to current code and must meet that 2 feet plus of 1 additional foot of freeboard to the bottom of the first floor structural members. However, we discovered after Sandy that a lot of people, because of the fact that riverfront community real estate is so ridiculously priced as compared to comparable buildings elsewhere in the state, we had a number of homes that were real estate assessed like around $1 million and had significant and what I would call substantial improvements done as repairs after Sandy that did not qualify as substantial improvements because they did not represent 50% of the appraised value. So in Piermont, we do our tax assessments not the same way as everybody. We do real property tax where when a home sells, the following tax year, the value that that home sold for is its new assessed value. So that means the homes that have changed hands in the last decade, a lot of them sold for a whole lot of money. And so if you're in a similar situation to that, when you look at the substantial improvement clause, I would recommend, as was indicated on one of John's slides, that substantial improvement be not 50%, be somewhere less than that. And I can't say what's the right number for a given community, but I can tell you if you have waterfront property, it's probably expensive enough that 50% substantial improvement is not doing what you want it to do.
Great, thank you. John, do you have a few thoughts you might want to share?
Yeah, if everybody's not tired of hearing me already. We're fortunate. We have a very mature system. We've been in the program since '92. So, getting into the program is a lot harder than staying in the program, particularly if you're not looking to advance it a whole lot. We've had a very positive experience, but I can honestly say I'm probably at about the same level that Russell mentioned, in that floodplain management in general occupies about 10% of my time. And because I've got contributions from our building department and our planning department, it really reduces the amount of effort on a day-to-day basis that we have to apply. Getting the word out, again, is a hard thing, but we've been so successful getting the word out about the program that we've gone from, I think we've added about 60 new policies in the past couple of years, and almost all of them are outside the special hazard floodplain, which is a little frustrating for our administration because they're not getting a significant benefit from that. We've gone through, in 2 of the past 3 years, we've had floods of record on Lake Ontario, and 80% of our policies are on the lake. Our community has Lake Ontario frontage, mostly old housing stock, and then we've got 9 little creeks that weave through the town, and about 50% of our total floodplain has been mapped by FEMA. And that's what's necessitated us to expand our law to deal with the creeks. We've had people proposing building right in the middle of a creek, and you explain it's in the floodplain, and they waive the floodplain, the FEMA map, and say, no, there's no FEMA on this property, and say, well, there's a creek running through it. What do you think happens? So that's why we are where we are. And getting in front of being proactive and working with the remaining development, I'd say, is the biggest improvement that we have made. Participating with planning board to make people aware right from the onset of a project's concept of the realities of a floodplain, and just how we're in a flat community on top of it. You can't count on being a foot away from the map floodplain. The data is too old for that. You've got to give it a buffer. And we've been very successful working with our developers in that respect. And I think that's probably where we've made the biggest gains. About it.
Great. You have a bunch of.
I had one thing just to.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to bounce one thing off of John's comment. I think it's a really important comment to look at the FEMA flood map information as backward-looking instead of forward-looking. Being on the riverfront here, one of the biggest issues we're dealing with is sea level rise, because we are tidal. It is estuary and where we're at. And we've been seeing it. Our high tides are getting higher every year. We have several roadways which now experience nuisance sunny day flooding that never happened when I was a kid. So it's real and it's in front of us, and that's one of the things that PWRC has been trying to work into our municipal fabric, as it were. And we have something coming up for a public hearing and a vote at the end of October as another amendment to our building code, specifically looking at land use planning. So what we're doing is the Waterfront Resiliency Commission has 5 commissioners, one of whom is the Commissioner for Land Use Planning. And whenever a application for a site development plan comes into the planning board, it's going to be sent out to the Commissioner for Land Use Planning for an advisory opinion. This is a non-binding opinion. It's different than our engineer and our floodplain managers report that deal with the advisory-based flood elevations that are historical data. This is going to be a projection of possible sea level rise scenarios and how they impact flooding at that specific location. And that document will be provided property-specific report, just one parcel on the report, actual numbers with ranges of sea level rise impact and actual depth of flooding on the parcel in those scenarios. And that'll be distributed to both the applicant and the members of the planning and zoning boards for their review and incorporation into their decision-making process. So I think it's important when we're dealing with anybody who's in a situation where the water they're concerned about is attached to the ocean, that you try to accept that the numbers we're working with from the National Flood Insurance properties are ones that are out of date every year because they just keep getting further and further out of date. And you should accommodate, which you can do in the form of an extended buffer, but you should just incorporate the sea level rise conversation into the discussion too.
I have one comment on, it's kind of interesting. We're in Syracuse, we might be on the kind of the other end of this, and many of the properties and residents in the floodplain are actually lower income. We're dealing with that rather than kind of the higher income side. And it's even hit the level where there's been a tax exemption if you're required to have flood insurance for certain households below a certain level of income only. We also deal with commercial development. So it's lower income and commercial development within the floodplain. For the CRS program, the impetus may not be just to reduce the insurance rates by certain, not trying to hit that level, but what I think it does is it focuses your community's efforts for floodplain management and also gets the word out there as well. It helps to drive your efforts. Should the goal just be a 10% reduction in your flood insurance? Probably not. But again, it's more just to reduce risk and make sure everyone knows about the risk as well.
Excellent points. So I'll just say there are a number of questions coming in. One sort of group of questions kind of coalesces around, should we even start this process or not? And how do we make that decision to try to join the process, the program or not? So a couple sub questions on that topic around, is there a significant, what would be considered a significant number of policies? And then another related question, if the number of policies and claims are minimal, less than 20, at what point is enrollment worthwhile? So that, and I think, I'd love to hear from you on that, but then also there's a specific question for John, but I'd love to hear from all of you. I know, Nate, you talked about it to some degree. Did the town of Greece perform any analysis, spatial or otherwise, comparing the insurance savings with program participation cost to the municipality? A way to quantify the cost benefit ratio in order to sell the participation to the community.
As I understand it, in ancient times, before I had any involvement, that form of analysis was being done. I've been a part of it for 20 years, and I have never done that. One of the limitations is now the policy information on individual policies is not as forthcoming as it once was, and there's a lag. I'm getting, it's like driving by looking in your rear view mirror and seeing if there's any damage done. It's not very effective. I believe I have 200 policies, but I don't have real-time information on that. I don't think it's a large amount of our task. I don't think anybody is doing significantly different than we would do if we weren't in the CRS, except for our annual and periodic audits. I'm interested in it for reducing flood damages. We have a lot of flood damages in our community, and that's my push. But the data to make the evaluation that was done in the past, it just comes in too late to really do that. But once you're in, getting out would create a political firestorm. And I certainly don't want to, be the one to light the match on that. So once you're in, particularly in deep, and the people come to, they get a mortgage expecting a discount, it's quite irreversible. You got to keep rowing. So I don't have to face that.
That's a good point. Russ, do you have anything to add to
Well,
that?
I believe we have about 250 policies within Syracuse. We've been in for, at least 20, 25 years as well. And I don't know of any cost benefit analysis that was done. That's a good thing to do, and it certainly would sell the program when you're trying to get into it. Again, we're kind of at the point of looking at how do we reduce the risk at this point? Part of this process, and probably most towns are already doing it, or if they're involved with their county, is their hazard mitigation plan. This floodplain management is part of your hazard mitigation plan. And CRS, to get the CRS points, you can get a good number of points just having that plan and certain mitigation alternatives. So again, it focuses your floodplain management just to be within that plan.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I just will throw in there that the company that we hired as a consultant to finish up with CRS for us in the village of Piermont is the same company that did Rockland County, our home community's hazard mitigation plan a few years ago.
Right.
And so there is this disconnect with New York State not treating this the same as other states like Florida, where counties would be applying to the CRS program rather than it being up to individual home rule municipalities.
That makes a lot of sense. Some additional questions we have here are about working with municipalities. So one question is, for the communities on the panel, how receptive have residents, local leadership been to the ideas about regulating to a higher standard, for example, restricting development in areas vulnerable to sea level rise, or thinking about how climate change is driving more intense rainfall events? And related to that, any issues with pathing standards such as lower substantial improvement, which may be more restrictive than the New York State Building Code?
Right. Well, within Syracuse, we did adopt the higher standards as the other communities did, the BFE +2, including no net fill within the special flood hazard area. That new law is only 4 years old now, 2016. There wasn't a lot of, at the time it was enacted, there was not a lot of debate or protest. It seems now, as we have commercial development, we kind of get some pushback on it at this point from the commercial developers, especially substantial improvements. We really have to go to this BFE +2 for things. So it gets a little tricky, especially with commercial and private development. Those laws do have a variance process, which now some of the developers are actually looking into variances. So it gets pretty tricky.
When we passed our law, I was kind of on hold for a couple of town board meetings until they found a good town board meeting that didn't have a lot of interest. I think we were in the middle of a very nice day during the summer, and it got passed. I think if I had any opposition, I would have had to wait another couple meetings because the fear of a pushback. Now that it's in place, it really doesn't get much attention because we were doing the things that were in the law, you know, for at least 10, 15 years before it was passed. And you know, our planning board chairman kind of shouldered the responsibility for any flack. He said that, you know, it was his purpose, but it didn't score us any CRS points because it wasn't backed up by law. And I think that's really the key when you're thinking of doing things. You can do some spectacular things, but if it's not part of your code and you don't have a track record to prove that you're following your law, there are no CRS gains to be made. You just have a warm feeling that you're doing good things. So to button it up, you got to have the law. To one of Nate's points concerning substantial damage, what we have explored for our lakefront communities, there are instances where homes are, I don't want to knock them by calling them shacks, but they're very modest homes on very valuable land, and it's 50% the value of the structure. And frequently what happens is we've got these micro mansions being built where there once was a hovel. At closing, dozer shows up, eliminates the prior residence, and puts a $500,000 home on it. But to get a substantial damage, there isn't as much to do if you have a very simple home, you know, valued at $100,000 or whatever. And even if they go and elevate it 6 feet, which we're seeing a lot of, you know, that's a substantial improvement. And it basically, they then pay for the home rather than the flood insurance, because their flood insurance goes down enough to pay for the improvement. So that's been our experience with that.
Yeah, there was a lot of opposition during the remapping process. Probably everybody experienced that, especially from residential owners. But we're kind of past that point now, and it's more application of the law and going forward.
Yeah, I'd love to circle back to mapping. I think you've addressed this to some degree, but if anybody wants to say anything more, someone asked, John mentioned building departments. How do we convince planning and zoning departments to happen before building departments can give a permit to reject new development in floodplains? Maybe, you know, not convinced, but what are some of the mechanisms that you found to be successful?
Mapping, GIS is great for that. Without having decent mapping, you know, the people at the building counter wouldn't know it's in a floodplain. They wouldn't know there's a creek there. But we've made a significant effort over the past, you know, 5 or 10 years to really upgrade GIS so that every employee can at least view a good quality GIS map, and that's been really the key to avoiding oops. Just, you know, issuing a building permit and then go, oh man, I went driving out to the site and it's you know, it's in the middle of a creek, or it's, you know, on the edge of one of our ponds or something. But that's really been the key, is getting that information right where it's needed, and that's at the building counter.
Yeah, no, I would have to agree with that. We did some great mapping projects, including we actually made a 3D printed topographical map that had the flood zones overlaid on it and actually had a 3D representation for each structure. So that was not just great for the building department, for the public too. One of the things that PWRC has done a lot of good stuff that gives us credit towards CRS with is outreach. So we established 2 annual meetings, one in the fall at Village Hall and one in the spring at our pavilion, where we're presenting information about all the programs that we're working on, and we're doing things like distributing the flood guide that we put together that does also have a map on it with evacuation routes and highlights where the ABFE zones are. There's an inventory of those kept at the building department to give out to people that come in and are looking at applications in the zone. Just one of the things that we found out in the first meeting that we had was that right after Sandy, a half a dozen people sold their homes, and the people that bought them didn't have any awareness that they had flooded. And so I had people come to this meeting and then like tap me on the shoulder afterwards and say, "Excuse me, I just bought this house. Does that mean that I am going to get a flood?" And, you know, I would ask them, "Well, were you required to get flood insurance by the mortgage company?" And they would say, "Yeah, of course, but it was a technicality. They said it was nothing to worry about." Well, they don't make you do it unless there's something to worry about. So there's a lot of education, not just with the building department personnel, which in our community, we don't have a single full-time person in the building department. We have 2 part-time people. So there's not, you know, there's not a lot. But with public outreach, you can also educate the people themselves and put the mapping materials in their hands and you know, create some kind of an awareness that way. But in terms of the question of convincing people that it's okay to adopt measures like the flood damage prevention building code updates, we actually didn't see any objection whatsoever to the code itself, which is kind of telling, because the place that we're starting to run into trouble now is that now that it's in place for years and we have some projects that are coming up in the special flood hazard zones, people are starting to get an idea of what that actually means. Right. And we're also running into other sections of our code, because when you look at elevating a building, we are a residential community that, you know, our viewscape is very important to a number of our residents. Therefore, the height of adjacent buildings is very important to a number of our residents. And we have a limitation of no taller than 32 feet in most of the community. We have plenty of houses that are just about 30 foot. But if you come in and you want to put 6-8 feet of elevation under it, now all of a sudden you need a variance for over height. So you're complying with the flood damage prevention code, but you're creating the need for a variance because of the height of the building now. And so far, the Zoning Board of Appeals has been fairly lenient in allowing those variances to go through when they're specific to building height only, and when it's as a result of elevation rather than adding a new, you know, story to the building. So we've muddled through that. But I mean, there was a project that came up for advisory opinion at our last planning board meeting, or maybe 2 planning board meetings ago, where somebody is looking to build a very, very small house, you know, 600, 700 square feet, not much more than that, but in an area which is underwater. 90% of the parcel is underwater at high tide every day. There's one small section that's like 10 by 20 feet that doesn't have water on top of it at regular high tide. And she's looking to put a house there that's elevated like 12 feet. And so a comment was made that essentially a small house on 12-foot stilts is the same as putting up a billboard on our bucolic marsh back street. And people, you know, are not very excited about that prospect. So I think there's a difference between getting the words on paper into the village code and people actually having an awareness of what the ramifications of that change are. And some of the unhappiness comes down the line when they see the super enormous tall building go up down the block.
That makes a lot of sense. Russell, do you have a thought on?
Well, we do at the permit desk. There is an automatic check to see if a property is within the floodplain or the structure. Also, I think our county has the disclosure upon selling a house. You must disclose that you're within the properties within the floodplain. I'm not sure if your other communities have that, and it's not. I don't think it's New York State law yet, but yeah. You don't have to disclose in Piermont, no.
We supposedly have one, but I haven't seen evidence of it ringing true.
Okay. A lot of exceptions, huh?
It's interesting. We have within our town, we have a service request system, like probably many communities have, where a citizen calls in with a complaint, it's registered and it's kept in a database. And what's astonishing is the frequency with which a person having bought a house will call in and say that they have a drainage problem, and their understanding is that there was never a drainage problem at their home in the past. And they're just stunned when you give them a ream of paper of prior complaints by the seller that signed a document saying to them that there's no history of flood problems or drainage problems. And, you know, we asked them, maybe they want to revisit that issue. But, you know, what can you, it's just incredible the liberties people will take with interpreting a drainage or flood problem.
Right.
There's some good ideas for some state level
Yeah.
state level guidance and regulations. We have a couple sort of pointed technical questions, and then we might end with some broad questions. A broad question for all of you. A couple of the pointed question, how do we find out which homeowners in the municipalities are paying for flood insurance premiums? Sounds like from John, what you said, that is no longer necessarily a straightforward thing to do.
Yeah, I'm full disclosure, I've got my ISO cyclical audit that occurs every 5 years coming up in 2 weeks. And I've been working for 9 months to get that very information from FEMA. And there's basically you've got to sign a document saying that once you get it, you won't map it and publish the information. And when you're done with it, you'll destroy it. But that's taken me 9 months. And what I still don't have it. This is 2 weeks before my audit. And I believe I'll get it. And I don't know if I'll have it in time to do a good presentation. But what got me to as close as from a promise, you know, from them that they'll give it to me was, oh, CRS audit. Okay. It is the individual privacy is being protected. And I got to honor that in today's world. To have somebody honor individual privacy is great. But it's tough to get very important information to make a critical decision. And if I can't get it, I'm thinking if a prospective homeowner was trying to get it, he'd have no chance unless somebody with a loose lip at the municipality let it out. And they'd probably be in some sort of trouble with FEMA if it got disclosed that they dropped the word.
That's an excellent point. And that could be a whole nother discussion, I think, focused on, I think that would be an interesting discussion. So maybe since we just have a few minutes here, I'll give you the last question, but then also, you know, if you have any closing thoughts, please work them in. This person wanted to know about which of the CRS actions they felt were the least and most challenging.
There's actually in CRS, there's a spreadsheet you can find that says who's getting points for what percentage of the communities get it.
Yeah.
My understanding that there's a flood warning one that I think only 2 communities in New York State have gotten, and one of them is the city of Batavia. You can get it because your floodplain is in the middle, is all from a creek or river running through the middle of the community. And if you put a gauge with an alarm on it, you satisfy that requirement. Anybody that has their flood risk dispersed can't get it. The easiest thing to get is if you have a floodplain that is not going to be developed, that's town owned or a wildlife sanctuary, that's like fishing in a barrel. That's the easiest.
And that's a lot of points too. A lot of potential points.
Huge. It's 2 classes. We would clearly not be a 6 without it.
Right. Open space preservation, being part of that hazard mitigation plan gets you a lot of points right away. Drainage system maintenance for more urban areas, we get a lot of points from that. That might be less so in the more rural areas. They all do. I don't know that there's any easy ones, maybe except for maybe that open space preservation. The rest still do take a good amount of documentation and kind of upkeep. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're right here at the end. Does anybody have any quick closing thought they'd like to share? Something they didn't get to say that they hope to?
I got it all out there.
Yeah. It was a great discussion. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Again, I would say to use the, kind of use the CRS, maybe as that one way to reduce your insurance policies, but also to focus your floodplain management, kind of that dual focus. Yeah.
That's a great ending thought. Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining the panel today and for all your insights from your experiences. And thanks to everybody coming. It was a great turnout and a good set of questions. We didn't get to all of them, but I think we hit on a lot of them. So thank you, and hope to keep this discussion going. Through your organizations. And we didn't get to the resilience. Sometime you talk more about the Hudson Resilience Working Group that you're part of. So yeah, keep this conversation going. And again, reach out to myself or the panelists if you want any more information. We will be sharing the list of links and the presentations to all the participants.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Savannah, do you have anything to add here?
No, you covered it all. Just a reminder that the survey and the links to the handout documents will be sent in the follow-up email. And thank you all, including you, Kristen, for presenting and facilitating that panel.
Great panel. Thank you.
Yes.
Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.